Welcome to this short taster lecture on antimicrobial resistance. So for the next 10 minutes or so, our learning outcomes are going to be to develop a basic understanding of antibiotic and more broadly antimicrobial resistance and the underlying mechanisms, to understand why antimicrobial resistance is a growing healthcare problem, and finally to get an awareness of some specific problem infections such as MRSA, which you may have already heard of. But we're just going to start with what antimicrobial resistance actually is. So this is when a microorganism, such as a bacterium, or could be a virus, a fungus, a parasite, when a microorganism is no longer inhibited or killed by a drug that was previously used to treat an infection that was caused by that organism. So they no longer work. So in the case of bacteria, that's when they become resistant to specific antibiotics that would usually kill or inhibit the growth of those bacteria. And similarly, viruses can become resistant to antiviral drugs, parasites to antiparasitic drugs, and fungi to antifungal drugs. So just want you to take a moment to think about, why does antimicrobial resistance matter so much? Why is it such an important topic? And here I've given a few reasons, but they're not the only reasons. But antimicrobial resistance makes infections more difficult to treat. So for example, it might be that you can no longer use the desired first-line treatment to treat an infection if it's already resistant to that particular drug. Also, microorganisms can become multi-drug resistant. They're not just resistant to one type or one specific antimicrobial agent, they're resistant to many, which can make it very complicated to treat those infections. Some infections as well have almost no remaining treatment options, and in some rare cases there are no remaining treatment options for certain resistant infections. So of course, all of those lead to worse health outcomes for patients for a number of reasons. It can take certainly longer to treat infections. You might have to use less desired drugs to treat the infections. They might be less desired because they're less efficacious. Perhaps they have a worse side effect profile, or they have greater toxicity. Perhaps they interact with patients' other medications. So there's lots of different reasons why there are worse health outcomes for patients. And in some cases, it might be very difficult to cure an infection. And of course, all of those things also lead to more cost for the healthcare system. So for the rest of this short session, I'm going to focus specifically on bacteria and resistance to antibiotics. So I'm sure you're all familiar for the fact that we've had lots of different types of antibiotics now for many years. So even back to the early 40s, when there was widespread introduction of penicillin, here I've just given a very few examples of specific antibiotics and when they were introduced. Unfortunately, alongside development and introduction of new antibiotics has been reports of resistant infections. And again, I've just shown you a few examples of infections on the left of this timeline. And importantly to note, if we take this one example here, so the introduction of this antibiotic in 2000 and the first report of this resistant infection just the following year. So a big problem is the increase in resistant infections to the antibiotics that we have available. But a parallel issue is that at the same time, over the last few decades, we've seen a decrease in the development and approval of new antibiotics for us to use. So less new antibiotics coming into use at the same time as increased resistant infections to those that we have available. So what actually leads to antibiotic resistance or antimicrobial resistance? What are the mechanisms that bacteria use to become resistant to antibiotics? So to answer that, we first need to just briefly look at how antibiotics actually work. And in this session, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of some of the key mechanisms of action. So although we have a large number of antibiotics available, they have limited mechanisms of action. And this slide shows several of the key mechanisms of action that they have. So here's a little cartoon bacterium. here on the right with some of the key targets of antibiotics. So I'll just pick out a few. So number one here is cell wall synthesis inhibitors. So this includes antibiotics like the penicillins. So they inhibit the synthesis of this bacterial cell wall, shown here in red. Another large group of antibiotics are those that target protein synthesis within the bacterium. So they might have slightly different detailed mechanisms of action, but broadly a large number of antibiotics that we use inhibit bacterial protein synthesis, whilst many others target different aspects of nucleic acid synthesis, such as RNA or DNA synthesis. So that's some of the basics of how antibiotics work. So how do bacteria become resistant to those? So actually, some bacteria have an inherent or natural resistance to certain antibiotics. But for this session, I want to focus on what we call acquired resistance. So this is where there's some sort of change or acquisition of genetic material that confers resistance to the antibiotics. And there's two mechanisms I want to briefly introduce you to. The first one is vertical evolution, and the second one is horizontal. Vertical evolution, is depicted on this slide, is where bacteria, they typically undergo spontaneous mutation. So as they're replicating, every now and then they undergo spontaneous mutations. A small fraction of those spontaneous mutations can contribute to antibiotic resistance. So this is a normal phenomenon. It happens in the absence of antibiotics. So in this diagram, imagine the grey bacteria are the normal susceptible bacteria, and the red one is one that's undergone a spontaneous mutation that has contributed to being more resistant. If you then apply antibiotic, which is a selective pressure, you'll then tend to kill off those that are susceptible, that don't have the resistance, and those that are resistant will then replicate and will tend to become the more prevalent or predominant type of bacteria. So that's vertical evolution. The second type of acquired resistance is where bacteria acquire genes or DNA from other bacteria. They can swap genes in a number of ways, depicted here. So one is by conjugation, so by direct contact between bacteria, by transduction via a bacterial virus, or some bacteria can uptake DNA from their environment, called transformation. So in that sense, they can very quickly acquire, for example, a gene that encodes something that confers resistance. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more on the next slide. So they've got a change in the genetic material. How does that give them resistance? So here's just some examples of how it can give resistance. So for example, the bacteria might have what's called an efflux pump. So this is a pump that can pump antibiotics out of the bacterium so that the antibiotics never really reach the concentration that's able to inhibit or to kill the bacterium. So they just pump it out of the cell. Second, quite common mechanism of action is that the bacteria express an enzyme that's able to break down or alter the antibiotic such that it becomes inactive. Another common mechanism is that the bacteria can change the target of the antibiotic. So a slight change in the target means the antibiotic no longer recognises or binds that target, but for the bacteria it doesn't affect them and they continue to proliferate. And a final example that I've given here is that bacteria can alter their cell metabolism to try to get around the mechanism of action of antibiotics. So that's just some of the examples of the underlying mechanisms. So finally, I just want to introduce you to a few examples of specific problem infections for the healthcare system. They're by no means the only ones. So the first two I want to mention are MRSA and CDI. So MRSA is methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. You might have heard of this. And CDI is Clostridium difficile infection. So these were two particular problem infections, certainly in the mid-2000s in the hospitals, and they were increasing in numbers. In recent years, they've come down in the number of cases every year. But these were particular problems. MRSA because of the resistance, and Clostridium difficile more because this is caused by use of antibiotics or overuse of antibiotics rather than the main problem being its resistance. We do have drugs that can treat these infections. However, certain other infections are growing problems due to increasing resistance. I'm just giving 3 further examples here, the first of which is multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. So this is already a difficult infection to treat, and multi-drug resistant tuberculosis is even harder to treat. And then the final 2 examples are called glycopeptide resistant enterococci, or GRE, and carbapenem resistant Enterobacteriaceae, or CRE, or you might hear it referred to as carbapenemase producing, which is CPE. And here's just a little graph of the cases of CPE in the UK over the last few years. So you can see that there's a growing number of cases. And why is this a particular problem infection? So in the case of CPE, this is a group of bacteria that are resistant to carbapenems, which is a group of antibiotics that we really use as sort of last line of defence type of treatment. And they're resistant to these antibiotics as well. So a summary of our problem. At the same time as the decrease in development and approval of new antibiotics, we have the increase in some of these particularly problematic infections, many of which have got multi-drug resistance and are quite difficult to treat, or we have far fewer agents that we're able to treat them with. So how much did we learn? Hopefully after this short taster lecture, you've got more of an understanding of what antibiotic and antimicrobial resistance is and some of the mechanisms underlying that. Hopefully you understand why antimicrobial resistance is such a healthcare problem. And you've got a bit more of an awareness of specific problem infections such as MRSA. Pharmacologists continue to play a crucial role in the ongoing development of drugs to fight major diseases, including new antibiotics, antiviral drugs, and vaccines for infectious diseases. You will learn a lot more about drug development and ways in which you can contribute in the future on the pharmacology programme.